Welcome everyone to this high-level webinar hosted by the SRC towards a Caribbean trade strategy. About 4 months ago, we received an email from a concerned trade policy enthusiast, Ms. Marcia Thomas, who in the middle of the COVID pandemic was lamenting what in her view was the absence of a clear voice on a Caribbean trade agenda. Why, she asked, wasn't she hearing from our policymakers, our academics, private sector and regional entities about what the strategic direction the Caribbean is going in and what our collective call to action was as a Caribbean community? Today, I am very happy to say that we have collaborated with Ms. Thomas and heeded the call to have this high-level version of our SRC Lunchtime chat. It's specially curated to host industry, captains of industry, thought leaders, power brokers, to help us make a modest contribution, I think, to the delineation of a Caribbean trade strategy. If you survey the trade cognoscenti in the region, you will hear a couple of constant voices from civil society who are dedicated and trying to make a contribution to the civil society voice. You would have read Elizabeth Morgan, who writes a column in the Gleaner, the David Lewis's and David Jessup's, the Caribbean Trade Law and Development blog, CARICHAM today. And we at the SRC are also trying to do our part by putting out some SRC trading thoughts and publications. But we need something more. Those of us who are sitting a little bit in the sidelines, we can't discern a very clear trade strategy. And COVID squarely in our midst presents us with a ripe opportunity, we think, to assist policymakers to help in the formulation of that strategy. Of course, we know our government officials and CARICHAM are working very hard in the trade agenda, but we as civil society want to add and we want to contribute to and be part of the formulation of that strategy. Before we get started, let me provide a brief glimpse to all of you, those who know about the trade agenda in the region. This may be a little bit hackneyed, but just to level set. We have to start with the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, whose aim is to deepen the regional integration process across Caribbean member states through the creation of the Caribbean single market and economy. But Article 8T of the RTC, which deals with the coordination of an external trade policy, calls for member states to coordinate their national trade policies to have a common position from which to negotiate effectively with third parties like the United States, Canada, etc. Of course, the understanding being that the CSME is at the base of that negotiating effort. Now, how has CARICHAM fared so far? From what we can see, CARICHAM's external trade policy and strategy follows from 1990s to 2015 a combination of both neoliberal and neo-mercantilist policies. Neoliberal meaning that we negotiate free trade agreements, but neo-mercantilist meaning we protect our domestic and regional market through principles and policies of non-reciprocity and special and differential treatment. CARICHAM has been involved in negotiations of a bilateral nature, such as the FTAA, the CARIFORUM EU-EPA, and most recently, negotiations with Canada. Multilaterally under the Doha Round, we remain engaged in ongoing negotiations amidst claims that the WTO is in crisis. The framework to negotiate these agreements has been really initially the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery, now the Office of Trade Negotiations within the Caribbean Secretariat, and the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on External Trade Negotiations overseen by COTED and the heads of conference. Other negotiations have taken place with the support of the CARICHAM Secretariat, such as negotiations with the DR, Cuba, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Colombia. Since 2015, the CARICHAM has contemplated a trade strategy. It has negotiated in the context of the WTO with all WTO members. But the question is now, is it time to formulate a new Caribbean trade strategy? And we say strategy because we don't want just an agenda, but we want a clear defensive, offensive, short-term, medium-term, long-term overall strategy towards trade negotiations. So we thought really long and hard about what types of interests we wanted to accommodate on this panel. And I think we got the mix very right. We have, from the government trade policy perspective, Honorable Sandra Husbands, Minister in the Ministry of Trade of Barbados. We have Ms. Pam Cook-Hamilton, congratulations, newly minted Executive Director at the ITC, her first week. We are pleased also to have, from the University of the West Indies, Professor of International Business of the UWI, Professor Densil Williams. We have Dr. Justin Ram, a former Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank, now a CEO of GSEC, it's a fintech consultancy outfit. And we have the Chairman of CARICHAM, the Caribbean Chamber, a mixture of the Chambers of Commerce, Dr. Dax Driver. So I know that was a lengthy introduction, but we really wanted to set the scene clearly to allow these speakers then to really begin the conversation going. Over the next hour, and we plan to keep it to an hour, we will ask each speaker to lead off on a topic, inviting the others to speak and to join in. We will try to reserve 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you have questions during their presentations, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. Enough from me. Let me turn to my esteemed panelists, and I want to start really with Honorable Sandra Husbands. Thanks for joining us. But being at the forefront of a government policy, involved in not just formulating the trade policy for your country, but also for the part of the regional context, can you explain what is the process currently underway in CARICHAM for negotiating and formulating trade policy, and how should we understand that now in the broader international context? Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and a real pleasure to be here with such esteemed persons, and I'm really looking forward to hear what they have to share on the nuts and bolts of where we should go in terms of strategy. In terms of CARICHAM and its strategy, as you very well outlined, the various organs that have formulated positions on behalf of CARICHAM and what CSME and heads of government co-head do together in order to advance the trade strategy of the CARICHAM region. What I want to focus the attention on, however, is the fact that there's a need for a renewal of that strategy because of what is happening worldwide. And this will change the way in which we approach the development of our trade strategy. First, one of the things that you would have noted is back in the 20th century, you would have had, especially the early to mid part, you would have had dominant trade players in Europe, America, UK, the usual persons, Canada. So you had very strong north-north trade. You also had strong north-south trade, where we sent up raw materials, they sent down finished goods to us. They had control over maritime, ports, financial system, etc. They had an advantage in science and technology, and their population has a strong entrepreneurial grasp. But what we noted has been happening in the 21st century is that there's been a change in the dynamic, that you now have new players who come on the scene, and we all know who they are, places like Japan, China, India, other parts of Asia, Brazil, etc. And that as a result of that, you've had shifting patterns in trade. What we saw happening, one of the changes that have occurred that we need to focus in on is in 2005, North-North trade was $4.8 trillion. By 2017, it was 5.2. But look at what happens to South-South trade. In 2005, South-South trade was only 1 trillion versus the 4.8 of North-North. But by 2017, South-South trade had risen to $5 trillion. What that meant was that the South had begun to unleash itself, and we all know that China was driving it. And what this means is that there's a change in the whole geopolitics coming out from that. So CARICHAM has to pay attention to that, to the issue of South-South trade and what it means. Now, we know of the proliferation of the free trade areas, regional trade agreements. And what data has been saying to us is that, look, with the Asian RTAs, the European, Canada, whatever, they actually get in inter-regional trade of close to 40 to 60%. So they've made good use of regional trade agreements. In terms of CARICHAM, in terms of our strategy and our initiatives, although we formed CARICHAM, we're really only getting at 1.17%, is actually down now to 13%. So we export something like $15 billion worth of goods. Sorry, yes, we export about 15 billion worth of goods. We probably import something like close to 20 or 23, but we are actually only purchasing 2 billion from ourselves. So what is happening is that we are missing the mark. It identifies the fact that we actually need to change what is our strategy. Now, what are some of the issues that have prevented us from really doing better with our trade agreements, with our engagement with each other and with the rest of the world? When you examine the figures, what you will see is that over time, there's been no diversification or broadening of the goods that we're exporting. That generally, they're the same types of goods that we've always been doing for the past 10, 15, 20 years. Also, there's been very little diversification of the market. So we're selling to the same narrow group of people, the same narrow set of goods. And what that has done, that has led to a very high level of vulnerability for all of our nations. So again, if we are going to build out a new strategy, which we have to because we've not been as successful as we could have been or should have been under the last strategy, and now with COVID is even more imperative, then we have to pay attention to that. Now, one of the things that was interesting with the growth of the South-South trade was that the consumption patterns in the South actually increased by 45%. So it means that instead of having this singular focus of trying to get into the American market, trying to get into the EU market, trying to get in, that we can actually look at maintaining those markets where we can, but broadening into other markets where people now have more disposable income and they're more likely to engage us. So part of the strategy going forward, to me, seems that policy, the initiatives that we build actually need to do that. Now, one of the things that has been of concern to me when I examined the old strategy, we did a lot of bilaterals, we did EPAs and so on. But while we took care to develop those, one of the things we failed to do was to have a program for building scale in our production. So we agreed to all of these agreements. We had these phased reduction of tariffs to give us time to build up. We did not do that. And now what we have are a set of bilaterals and a couple of EPAs where goods now can flow into CARICHAM, but we don't have the production capability to be able to take advantage of them. So in truth and in fact, we've not seen an increase in our exports in any of the bilaterals or any of the treaties in the way that we wanted to. So we've literally simply opened our markets by signing those treaties without going the next stage, build regional capacity. And what has this meant? It means that if you find yourself as an economy with a lot of small enterprises, they do not have the resources to be able to grow to scale. And it makes them now a victim in their own domestic market, because once those goods from outside begin to flow in, they're not going to be able to withstand the competition. So in the previous strategy, we focused a lot on protection, on using the trade tools to defend the markets and high tariffs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, failing to build regional production capability so that we can actually look at benefiting from the treaties that we have signed, and to be able then, because we take advantage of them, you're able to grow your enterprises so they're more resilient in their own market and so that they're capable of competing in the external markets. So from my perspective, there needs to be a complete revamping of our strategy and how we go about changing the dynamics that are affecting us in terms of taking advantage of the trade opportunities there. And I'll hold it there so that we can discuss.
Wonderful introduction. I think you've covered so many areas, really touched on it. You've like laid out the gauntlet for the others to follow as well. So thank you for these very interesting opening remarks. I wanted to pick up on some things that you said. And I'm going to ask Professor Williams if he wouldn't mind starting off here, which is Minister Husbands spoke about the fact that we need to expand our base a little bit and look beyond maybe the traditional sectors. I wonder if you could suggest to us what are the key and critical sectors in the Caribbean on which a trade strategy must be built. We have a mix of sectoral interests across the regions. We know that agriculture is generally on decline. Services are a major element of many countries' revenue. And now we have a boom in oil, for instance, in Guyana and maybe even Suriname. And in Trinidad, we may be declining a little bit in the reliance on oil. So in that sort of more economic business strategy, looking at it from that perspective, what are the markets and the sectors that you think we need to focus on?
Thank you very much, Dr. Remy, and thank you to the SRC for inviting me to speak. I know time is of the essence, so I will get into it. Let me also acknowledge my fellow panelists who are here with us, and also I think Dr. Paul is with us as well. Let me acknowledge him from the center. So thanks to Minister for that very comprehensive touching on the critical issues with our issues of trade right across the region. I would like to add my voice by focusing specifically, Dr. Remy, on what you just asked, which are the sectors that we need to pay attention to, and the general issue of how the trade impacts our revenue. As you would appreciate, I've done some work and looked at, for example, Caribbean countries and the percentage of their fiscal revenues that come from international trade. And when you look at it, it is actually quite interesting. A significant number of countries have over 1/3 of their revenues coming from the ports alone. When you look at places like Antigua, the Bahamas, etc., they have over 30% of their revenues coming from the ports. St. Lucia is about 21%, Grenada 28%, and so on and so forth. The Bahamas 34%. So it simply means that trade is an important part of the economic makeup for these countries, and therefore, if we don't get it right, we're in a little bit of bother in terms of fiscal space, creating proper fiscal policies, etc. So in that regard, I would like to make a few quick observations, given the limited time. The first thing I would want to say is that we need a growth pole for Caribbean economies. And I think given our structure, our size, and where we are located, etc., I think we have to look more seriously at the services sector as the important growth pole for these small island states. Yes, it's difficult for us to gain scale and scope in production and stuff like that. So what we need to do is to look at services, and you have also identified that services are now accounting for more than 2/3 of most economies' GDP. While there's a small number of countries that have commodities, services, there is really where a significant number of countries are going. So the growth pole we need to look at is how we build a more stronger and more value-added services sector. Now, to do that, there are some critical things that you have to do. You have to firstly build the human capital capabilities, because services is going to be heavily dependent on human capital. So we have to build the human capital capabilities, get them to the highest standards of training at the most international competitive levels. So we have to think about moving all citizens through the education value chain from preschool right up to tertiary. What is very frightening when I look at some data just yesterday is to see the small number of persons who matriculate from secondary to post-secondary education. Now, if we're going to participate in a global economy in the 21st century that is driven by smart automation, ICT, etc., the truth is that we cannot leave too many of our people at the primary and secondary level. We have to bring them to the tertiary level, because that is where you're going to get the value added, the critical thinking skill to participate in the global economy. That leads me directly into the things I want to say in terms of critical sectors that we have to focus on if we're going to build a truly valuable economy in the context of a 21st century global economic system powered by smart automation, information and communication technology. Sectors that we need to focus on: animation, software engineering, knowledge process outsourcing, medical outsourcing, development of our farmers, of our nutraceutical industry, including marijuana and hemp, among other things. These are very, very important areas. When you look at, for example, most Caribbean countries, they have a number of herbs and plants and those things in the nutraceutical industry that have significant value that we are not exploring, and we're not getting enough value from those. When you look at the knowledge process outsourcing industry, things like architectural design, things like medical services, things like accounting services, these are areas that we now need to start developing, and these are sectors that we need to start developing so that we can have a stronger knowledge outsourcing sector, rather than just the normal business processing outsourcing where we are just the back office for multinational companies and we do very basic stuff. We need to start to do high level stuff in these kinds of areas. Critically, in terms of markets that we need to look at, we know our traditional partners in North America, we know our traditional partners in Western Europe, but Africa is a huge market that is untapped, significantly, especially South Africa and more West Africa. A lot of potential in countries like Botswana, South Africa, Nigeria. Markets in Africa, critical for some of the things that we're talking about, some of the things that we're actually doing. South America, a critical area as well that we need to focus on. Asia, critical markets that we need to focus on. So, as Minister said, one of the issues that have dogged us for a long time is diversification of product. I would also say that diversification of market is something that we also need to focus on as we build a robust trade strategy for the region. So I'm going to stop there because I know I have other members of the panel who would like to speak, and I'll come back later to expound on some of these things.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I am apologizing in advance if I cut anybody off, because I know the audience wants to hear from everybody and wants to hear a lot. So I'm going to try to make sure we can expedite some of the discussion. But both of our previous first speakers have given us a lot to chew on. And as I turn now to Ms. Cook-Hamilton, I want to pick up again from what the professor just said, which is we need to start looking at new markets. And we hear that so many times, right? We hear that we need to look at Africa, we need to look at Asia. I wonder, given your unique bird's eye view, you've worked in the region and now you have a very panoramic view of how these things operate more globally. The mechanics of beginning to look at negotiating strategies outside of the United States and the EU and the Canadian market. How do we begin thinking about best deploying a strategy that seeks to negotiate FTAs outside of our traditional partners? What's the process for doing so? Where should we begin looking? If you could give some of your perspectives, that would be wonderful.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dr. Remy, and hello to the rest of the panel. It's good to see you all. I'm sorry that I'm not where you are, but I'm sure the Caribbean is much warmer than here, but hopefully I'll get there soon. The truth is, Jan Yves, what I'm looking at is the question is valid, it's relevant, but I'm not sure it's a question we should be asking. For me, the critical question is this. We have signed probably more trade agreements per capita than any other grouping in the world, given our size. Yeah, trade agreements aren't our problem. Our problem is how have we translated those trade agreements into actual market penetration and taken advantage of what it is that we claim we went to negotiate. And I think that is the fundamental weakness. The real elephant in the room is that we continue to operate at a disadvantage vis-a-vis these markets that we've opened up. We signed the EPA in 2008, 12 years later, our utilization rate is minimal at best. We have had preferential agreements. Lomé was mainly, of course, this traditional sugar, rum, rice, and bananas, and then bananas, of course, got killed. But utilization rate for CBI, 11%. Utilization rate for CARICHAM, 3%. Our trade surplus, or lack of a trade surplus, or trade deficit with Asia is in the tune of 6 billion. The 2019 numbers, and I don't think the minister has these because we just came out with them for CARICHAM, is that collectively we imported 36 billion in goods from the world and exported 21 billion, which means that our deficit is 15 billion with the world. And of course, our food import is just completely out of the way. Then we're talking about within CARICHAM, the only amount is 7 billion. So the trade within CARICHAM itself has not even taken advantage of the so-called CSME construct. So I think the bigger issue is that the more important question for us is what is it that has prevented us from actually taking advantage of agreements that we have so carefully and strenuously negotiated? Because there's no point in entering new negotiations if the ones that we currently have to our most traditional markets, wherein we already have an advantage and we're not using them, what is the point of going to negotiate new agreements? That's the first question. And that's what we need to look at. We look at the fact that, 70% of private sector employment is generated from MSMEs, right? So a lot of family-owned businesses, a lot of smaller businesses, etc. And so they also face a wide range of internal and external factors which affect their trade. And I think that is the fundamental issue. What are the issues that are affecting the ability of our firms to trade? Because governments can always negotiate FTAs. We're very good at it. But what happens when it gets to the point where businesses need to use it? The first thing is the high cost of doing business in the region. Our electricity costs outside of Trinidad and Tobago, and I guess now Guyana, given the discovery of oil, are prohibitive for a lot. And therefore we have to begin to look at how does the government facilitate green recovery? How does it begin to use alternative energy sources to promote the capacity to produce? The second thing is lack of technology and innovation. We have the lowest probably world average of R&D in the world. I mean, ours is at 0.7%. So how do we begin to look into the factors? And this picks up on what Professor Williams talked about in terms of, ensuring that our education and our ability to educate who we are is fit for purpose. If we can't do that, then we continue to educate for a 20th century market and we're in the 21st century. And that's a critical area. The third issue is the connectivity issue. We all talk about e-commerce and all the issues that need to move forward on e-commerce, but you look at connectivity in the region, and then we begin to understand that even with the online education process, you have hundreds of thousands of people who have no access. And so if we're going to talk about services as a base and we're going to talk about connectivity, then we have to address that fundamental issue. Finally, on non-tariff barriers, that's also a huge factor. One of our biggest challenges in utilizing the EPA has been issues regarding immigration, issues of access to the markets on terms of SPS measures and so on. So how do we address those factors to enable us to take advantage of the agreements that we already have? Should we look at Africa? Absolutely. We're looking at the African free trade area. That is going to connect Africa transcontinentally, which is a phenomenal opportunity. And given the linkages between the Caribbean and Africa, it seems to me to be a slam dunk. But what I would like to strongly suggest is that before we go off, negotiating another thing with Africa, let us be very clear strategically on what it is we want, what it is we can actually achieve, and ensure that it is a live agreement that can be utilized by all. So I'll just stop there. But those are my thoughts. Oh, let me give you three more things. Just 3 points. If you look, yes, just three. 2018, 72% of chilled frozen fish fillets exported from Guyana to the US did not claim preferences. 2018, 82% of jewelry and rum from Jamaica did not claim preferences on the CBI. In 2017, 86% of plastic bottles from Trinidad and Tobago did not claim preferences. Why? Why do we have agreements? We have a one-way preferential agreement called CBI, and we are exporting these goods which can, are eligible for preferences, and we don't use it. And those are just 3 examples. Anyway, I stop there. You hear my frustration. So
I think, no, not that I want your frustration, but I really want us to get into it. Why aren't we claiming it? I'm going to turn now really to the private sector. Thank you. These were excellent remarks. But I wonder if any of the next 2 speakers want to comment on that, which is we need to really start focusing on the things that matter. And I think Pam mentioned that it's, the trade negotiation is the last stage almost. It's you focus on the things like innovation, like connectivity and these sorts of things. She also said, let's focus on the reasons we cannot access the market. I wonder if any of our speakers disagree with that. And I wonder whether we are not using our trade agreements, and maybe it's a reflection of the fact that the current trade agreements are not where the business opportunities really are. So it's not even so much that we need to only focus on what, the capacity to engage in these negotiations, but maybe we've just been focusing on the wrong markets. And at this point, I really would like Dr. Driver from the private sector. You always say the private sector is brought in at the last minute. I want to put you front and center. What does the private sector want? I want to know, and where do you want to be in formulating the strategy? The governments last for 5-year cycles. The private sector is always going to be there. So tell us in no uncertain terms, Dr. Driver, what is it that the private sector wants to see from our Caribbean trade strategy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first of all introduce CARICHAM and explain what it is, because it's quite a new organization. So CARICHAM is a network of chambers of commerce from across the region. So there's 21 chambers. It's out, not just CARICHAM, also includes some of the non-CARICHAM Caribbean territories as well. And it's a network made up of the chambers, and we meet regularly online, and we discuss the issues, and we try to interact with the government agencies to advocate on behalf of our membership, but also share best practice and really try to identify what needs to happen to facilitate trade. Okay, so I really enjoyed the previous presentations, and I think that this point that we really need to emphasize is what we need is trade facilitation. We don't need so much the trade agreements. We actually need help getting into markets, and that's what I think what the private sector is looking for. So there's been a discussion about Africa. Let me just reflect on that, because I have taken trade missions to Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Nigeria, Ghana numerous times. These are service trade missions. So these are Trinidadian family-owned service companies looking to try to take advantage of opportunities in those markets. It is incredibly difficult. we have got very little business out of that. Those were all funded by companies themselves. They funded through the chamber. They paid for this. We got some small amounts of government facilitation, really through when you have individual diplomats in a country who cares about it. But many times you don't have diplomats who really care, and they don't see it as their job to help our private sector get into other markets. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to tell off Trinidadian high commissioners and ambassadors in markets in Canada or in Europe or in the UK who think it's their job to get UK or Canadian or American service companies work in the Caribbean. And I say, no, your job is to get our companies work there. Don't facilitate companies coming here. That's what the UK embassy in Trinidad is for. Your job is to get Trinidadian companies out. So that sense of trying to facilitate our companies and actually understand that it's businesses who trade. It's not governments who trade, it's businesses who trade. So let's put them at the forefront of the strategy. Let's help our businesses get out there into markets. So services trade is difficult. You need support on the ground. We're talking Africa. Mode 4, moving people from the Caribbean to Africa is incredibly expensive. You've got to fly through New York or through London, and it's a very, very expensive thing to do. Establishing a presence on the ground, for a lot of service industries, that's very, very difficult. The only one I can really think of at any scale has been Republic Bank, has managed to do it, but through a purchase in Ghana. So that was, that's a positive thing, service export, that they have, the commercial presence with Mode 3, I think you guys in trade call it, that they have a commercial presence there. But moving people is very tough. Doing things cross-border, the animation, these sort of things, if we can use digitization, I think there's potential there. There's good areas for SMEs, but again, we need the facilitation of our governments to help us. Every year I go to, on behalf of the Trinidad Energy Chamber, and we have 400 service company members in our chamber who are already doing business with multinationals, because that's what you have to do if you want to do business in the energy sector. You already have to meet their standards. Okay. Every year I go to OTC in Houston. I didn't go this year, so because of COVID, but almost every year I go to OTC, the biggest trade show for the oil and gas industry in the world. And it depresses me to see country booths from countries who have got really no experience and background in the oil and gas industry. But you see a South African country booth paid for by the South African government with South African companies who are providing services to Nigerian oil and gas industry. Why is there not a Trinidad and Tobago or Caribbean presence? We have the Caribbean has one of the oldest oil industries in the entire world. We have 110 years of commercial oil production. Why are we not promoting this? I know that the world is moving away from fossil fuels, and I take all of that, and so we need to be doing it with the renewables now, and I'm sure Justin will tell me that I need to do that as well. But when we are doing that, just giving that as an example, we don't support our companies. In fact, very often I find that our governments see their job is somehow to protect the people from our companies. It needs to be the opposite. We need to see that commitment to helping our companies get out there. CARICHAM is here to partner. All of the chambers of commerce in the region are here to do what we can. But I think that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that support, and we're looking to facilitate us getting into international markets and really begin to export. I'll close there.
Thank you, Dr. Driver. I'm hearing again, maybe our strategy belongs less in the quoted discussions and more, I think this is a theme, more helping the private sector, enter the markets, more figuring out the nuts and bolts of the capacity to enter the markets. I think that's what I'm hearing a lot so far. I wonder if I can move now for our first round to end with Dr. Ram. Dr. Ram, you have a lot of experience working with the CDB, and now you've entered into the private sector. So from your perspective, wearing that hat, how could the Caribbean sort of international regional organizations support or play a supporting role in the formulation and execution of these strategies relating to trade?
Okay, pleasant good afternoon, Dr. Remy and pleasant good afternoon to my fellow panelists. Such a wonderful opportunity to be on this panel with you, and good to see some of you who I haven't seen for quite some time. Of course, that is Pamela, it's great to see you. I just want to also reiterate what Dax was saying, that it really is, firms those are the institutions and organizations that trade. And unless we have a focus on what it is that they require in order to get the job done, then we're sort of almost like spinning top in mud. And in many ways, I think that is why we have not managed to take advantage of the many trade agreements that have been signed over the years that Pamela Cook-Hamilton has clearly identified. Now, with respect to your particular question, I think it all comes back to what our regional organizations, what should be their remit in this. Obviously, from my point of view, I think that regional organizations must facilitate. And if I was to perhaps just draw on, if I contrast the Caribbean Development Bank and the Caribbean Development Fund, for example, and give you an example as to what I think they really should be doing. Now, if we look around the world now, we know that trade globalization can actually lead to great opportunities for us to reduce poverty and actually increase employment. But at the same time, if it is not managed well, it can actually lead to some significant negative fallout. And of course, we have seen that over the recent years with the rise of populism. And in fact, it is actually no different here in the Caribbean. So in many ways, what our regional institutions need to do, and for example, as I was reflecting earlier, and as I was listening to everyone, I was thinking that the Caribbean Development Bank, for example, should really be more of like a Caribbean investment bank, focusing on how we actually help firms become a lot more competitive. How do we actually help our countries become a lot more competitive? Now, what does that really mean? How do you now build a strategy around making firms competitive? My time at the CDB, I don't think we've ever really looked at that from a firm perspective. So what does that mean? When I think about it in my mind, that means looking at, for example, the Porter six principles. You know, what is the existing rivalry? How are our firms competing actually now in the CARICHAM market? Can we actually use CARICHAM as the petri dish to actually build our competitiveness? I don't think that we have done that sufficiently. What about the strength of suppliers and the strength of buyers? Are these sorts of things that that we are contemplating? So how do we actually improve our firm's competitiveness? What about the barriers to entry and the substitutes for our products? And then there is this overall problem that we have here, the non-market forces. And that really refers to government policy. How is that actually impacting on what our firms are able to do? Now, if we are serious about this, then really an institution like the Caribbean Development Bank should really be focusing on how we make sense of all of these competing areas so that firms can have a playing field within the Caribbean in which to compete. Now, I want to reflect on perhaps the Caribbean Development Fund, because while firms are competing, we know that through trade agreements and globalization, we can have certain persons within our societies who may not be able to participate. And I would say that we need to have a focus perhaps at the CDF to ensure that now individuals are trained significantly to be able to participate in this labor market that allows us to now supply labor to export dynamic firms, as it were. Now, Dr. Remy, you are at UWI, and I think that the UWI must also play a significant role in this. Now, I haven't mentioned all of the various institutions. I'm just focusing on these three at the moment. The UWI really needs to also examine and be a part of any sort of trade negotiations, because the UWI should really be providing the evidence-based and the research for our trade negotiators based on understanding what are our capacities and capabilities within the Caribbean, and to understand that that is where we need to actually have trade agreements focus on. Because when you think about diversifying our small island developing economies, we have to think about what do we have capacity and capability in and try to build on that. What are the service areas? And I think that Professor Densil actually spoke about some of these things, but I think that the UWI should be providing that evidence base, that research, and that great level of analysis to supply to persons like, for example, the Honorable Minister, as for her to have in her mind, which are the areas that our Caribbean should be focused on in terms of trying to develop our markets, because it's based on strong evidence around our capabilities and our capacities. So Dr. Remy, I'm just going to leave it there for now, and we can come back and discuss later on.
Wonderful. You've given us such specific suggestions for specific stakeholders outside of government. And you told us CDF, CDB, the University of the West Indies. Prof. Williams, we have some work to do. We're trying, but we need to try even harder to fulfill that mandate. We have about 11 questions in the chat. I want us to be responsive to the questions. So I'm going to just throw some out there and see where they land over the next 10 to 15 minutes. I think one question from Mr. Satney is, what lessons did CARICHAM learn from the failed CARICHAM Canada negotiations? And as we think of a new strategy, what are we learning from that? I'm going to throw that a little bit your way, Honorable Minister. Let me pick up another one. Let me just do a round of them. Mr. Jeremy Blenman, the region is not by any means a resource-rich space. Managing our scarce resources and maximizing productive opportunities is essential. In this context, is there any value to a full review of our various sectors, and how do we do business to take account of this dynamic and drive more circular economic modes of doing business? I'm going to throw that at you, Professor Williams, to take a stab at that. Let me just look again. Mr. Driver, says an anonymous attendee, there are several export promotion programs operated by our countries aiming to facilitate exporting by our firms. What level of input does the private sector have in providing feedback on the design and operation of these programs, and how can the governments make them useful to firms? And then I'm also going to throw this one out. So for a Caribbean trade strategy, it calls for networking and cluster operations. This is from John Lewis. Collaborative initiatives and incentives driven by the government, private sector, and communities. So this is the first round of questions. I named some people, but I'm going to start with Honorable Husbands, then I'll go to Professor Williams, Dr. Driver, and see if any of the other esteemed panelists want to take these questions or any they're seeing in the chat. And I'll ask you please to limit your interventions to no more than 2 to 3 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
I'm extremely excited about what I've heard and wish we could have 3 hours. Let me just park the Canada question one side and just respond to something that I think is important. If we are only getting 13% of our trade is interregional, where we're trading with each other, and then when you look at the goods we're actually producing, everybody has their own beer factory. Everybody wants to produce their own toilet paper, etc. The truth is you actually have a number of products that we can actually produce for ourselves. If we could look at a handful of things that we use all the time, not one-off things, because that's not enough to support an industry, but something that you use all the time, and we can get manufacturers into a handful of products, it would actually help us to do more trade with each other. Second, I feel in relation to look at government procurement, $25 billion is spent every year by governments buying things from all over the world. Now, granted, some of those things we don't produce in the region and maybe can't, but how often do we go from we don't have it domestically and reach to extra regionally for our next stop, instead of asking the question, is there anybody else in the region who can provide this particular good or service? So I think that more can be done in terms of CARICHAM providing the opportunity for us to build regional production that will actually give us the scale to take on Africa. And then in relation to the issue of services, yes, we do have some issues in terms of access to certain markets, but let's get back to CARICHAM. Somebody mentioned about medical services. Somebody mentioned about the holistic herbs and so on, which we have. Why are we not marrying those two together? We have a problem with NDCs here in the region. Why are we not producing pharmaceuticals? We already have a small industry in it. Why are we not expanding it and then using Africa as a place to build out our scale? Why are we not taking things like, if we've got problems with diabetes and hypertension, we should be looking at the foods from the region which are healthy for us, and we should have innovators in food technology building a new generation of food snacks for our children so that we begin to help them to eat healthy and produce healthy foods using what is around us, and then exporting those foods the same way how we can eat macaroni pie and we can eat pizza, which is somebody else's food. We should be able to produce things from the breadfruit, etc., do it to scale and be able to export it. And all the breadfruit doesn't have to grow from here. Switzerland doesn't grow cocoa, but it's the world's chocolate producer. The point is, you can find where they are, produce the stuff, and export. And in services, yes, we have an advantage, and I really would love us to dive in more into that area. So I think there's a lot that we can do.
Minister, I noticed you cite you. I don't want to put you on the spot there, you know, but I'm gonna be a little cheeky, Minister, with the question about Canada. And CARICHAM, and if you can think of any lessons we might learn from that, I wonder. But I don't want to put you on the spot too much, so maybe I will throw it out also to any of the other panelists, what lessons we could learn. I'll give you an opportunity, but if you would like one of the other panelists to take that on, as well as the others I put on, I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, I think Pam could do a better job on that. I think she has more experience with that than I did.
All right,
so
okay.
I'm willing to hear what she has to say.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to put you there. But Professor Williams, I wanted to know if you wanted to pick that up, 2 to 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'll pick up on the 2 to 3 minutes, but I agree with Minister. I think Mrs. Coke Hamilton would be much better placed to tell us some of the lessons based on where she was placed as well. Initially, I thought about that and said, okay, I would like to hear her views. But quickly, as to the value of looking at a kind of a sector diagnosis and to see where our competitive advantage is. Clearly, there's a great value in there. I'm happy that Dr. Justin Ram brought in Porter's 5 forces analysis, because that is a kind of framework that is now needed to look at the sector analysis to say who are our buyers, who are our suppliers, what is the level of rivalry in our sector, what are the rules of engagement, what are the substitute products from the sector level, and then we can now drill that down and move the framework to the firm level to see how we get better competitive firms. But before we get there, one of the fundamental things that has to do between to the kind of 5 forces analysis is a kind of 2x2 matrix to say what is your competitive positioning within the thing. Are you going mass market? Are you going differentiation? Are you going focus differentiation? And based on that, you can now know where your playing space is going to be, because the general idea is that we have markets, we have trade rules and all of these kinds of things, but we can't be all things to all people. So we must find where our competitive advantage is, and then we try to hit that competitive advantage. That's what I would say, Dr. Remy.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you, Minister. But Pam, you're going to get the Canada question, but before we do that, let me bring in Dr. Driver. I had a special question for you on the export promotion programs. You have an answer for us?
Well, I can't really answer for the entire private sector of the region, but I could answer certainly for our experiences here with the energy chamber, and I think I could probably speak for generally the private sector in Trinidad and Tobago. Very limited. We don't feel we get really adequately consulted about how programs get set up. It's often more seeming to be told this is what the program is, and I don't think there's earlier enough engagement. Now, I would admit that sometimes that might be the private sector's own inability to organize itself through our respective associations and chambers, and we need to do a better job on that. But I also think it's an attitudinal issue which comes from a lot of these, a lot of the agencies, and they don't always, there's a lack of trust, I think, that exists, and they don't always have the trust to deal with the associations. I think that, and I think it has to be through associations, because you need associations which represent broad groups of people, not talking with individual companies at the level about designing programs. So you need to talk with the associations, let the associations bring together people, design what the programs are, and then I think you'll have a better chance of execution. I also think that there are biases in some of the organizations about certain products and services and markets, and there's a strong bias towards certain things, and I think that can impact what gets put together, and I don't think that is always useful. I think there needs to be more of an acceptance of listening, and not. I do find sometimes there are technocrats who think that they know what's best for the private sector, and instead of listening to the private sector, tell the private sector what they should be doing.
Very, very interesting, and we have people here who I hope are listening. Bring the private sector in at the more formal stages and no lecturing to them. Thank you so much, Dr. Driver. So the bonus question goes to Ms. Pam Cook-Hamilton on what happened with Canada, and anything else you wanted to comment on that came up. Not to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to say anything, and then I'll do a final round to Dr. Ram, and then a bonus for you all. So please go ahead, Ms. Cook-Hamilton.
Well, just quickly, I don't want to get into why Canada failed or why Canada didn't. The lessons that one would learn, I think, are based on what has already been said. That when there's a failure to engage at a strategic level as to what exactly you want, it is hard for some of our trading partners to know and to therefore negotiate if we're not clear on what it is that we want. And I think a fundamental part of the problem is that we had CARICHAM, and I guess the idea was to expand into services and so on, but there didn't seem to be a lot of meeting of the minds within CARICHAM, one, on what it is we wanted, and two, a meeting of the minds between CARICHAM and Canada on where this agreement was going to go, how far it would expand, what it would cover, and whether we actually could utilize it once it was completed. And so I think it was just the wrong time. It's my hope that at some point, if it is necessary, I'm not sure it really is, that we can do that in specific sectors. I've always thought of one of the services sectors has to do with, the nurses, the medical practitioners, the exchanges that we could do, the transferability of health insurance as a possibility in terms of partnering with Canada. I mean, there are a lot of options, but I think we needed to drill down more specifically on what are the areas that we wanted and what are the areas that we could take advantage of. That being said, I do see a question from Jerry Blenman about, strengthening BSOs and data collection. And I think that is critical. That's a major, major weakness that the Caribbean has and has always had. And you can't, I've always been kind of confused about how we negotiate, particularly services agreement with no data. How do we make offers? How do we sign off on things? And we have no data. You look for CARICHAM data and it's years old. So I think that it's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed if we're seriously going to be talking about going into services, which we've been talking about since I was with the R&M, and I left the R&M when Matthew was born, and Matthew is 20 this year. Therefore, it's a long time. The issue is what do we want to do, and how do we want to get that data so that we can make informed decisions about what is important, where we're going, and why we're going there. So I'll just stop there.
Excellent. And I think everybody is writing me saying, thank you for that answer, Ms. Cook Hamilton, about Canada. I think you did a great justice. Dr. Ram, I wanted to ask you, I'm hearing a lot of the we. How do we do this? And I think, forgive us if those of us out here are in a little bit of fatigue about this. Somebody in response to this webinar said, tell me when CARICHAM is ready for implementation and execution and I'll get on the call. Tell us, how do we move from this talk? How do we help the governments? Because I feel Dr. Professor Williams, we at you, we have a job to do. I'm empowered. I want you to feel empowered. We just got that mandate. So how do we help move this? How does the private sector move? What are we doing wrong? Give us some answers, please.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Remy. Well, it's always a difficult question, but I guess it all comes back to implementation. And I think that this saying by Drucker was probably actually meant for the Caribbean. You know, how do you avoid culture eating strategy for breakfast, right? So, but what I want to say to you now is that there are mechanisms out there. We don't have to go about reinventing the wheel about how you now go about implementing a sort of a trade strategy that I think that we all agree should be now private sector focused and building on our capabilities and our capacities. But as I've heard before, we know that we already have many free trade agreements out there. Now, how do we go about trying to capitalize on those? How do we use, for example, the CARICHAM single market and economy as that petri dish to sort of help us hone our skills and our overall competitiveness? Now, as you would imagine, within this, there are many moving parts. And so the implementation becomes very difficult. We can't really expect the persons who are now employed at CARICHAM to be able to do this. And I think what really needs to happen is that we need to set up a really proper functioning delivery unit at the regional level that perhaps reports on a quarterly basis to heads of government about how we're actually going to implement various aspects of our trade strategy. Now, what tends to happen here is that the heads have to agree on what the priorities are. And I think if we were to have some type of a consultation with the private sector, we could agree maybe next year, for example, what are the 5 key things that we need to focus on in our trade strategy to help us achieve and get to where we want to be in 2025 or 2030. So we come up with that overall high-level priority list. But before we actually go down the road of trying to implement that, I think it is important that we ensure that those are the right priorities. And it's important that we go back to the private sector, go back to our constituents and say, do you agree with this? Once we have got signed off from that, then I say, okay, it is time for us to now sit down and bring really good people from the private sector, from government, from academia together and work on an implementation plan for each of those five priority areas. Now, for each of those 5 priority areas, we need to have a dedicated sub-delivery unit that works on the actual implementation of these things. Working through, for example, the red tape, the regulatory hurdles. How are we communicating with the private sector, for example, so that they know what's going on? It's a crying shame that our firms are exporting products into markets where there's already preferential access that has been negotiated, and they are not claiming it. That has to be something. First time I'm hearing that today. That is crazy. That means that there's a lack of communication that they're unaware of. But that should be our priority. If we already know that we have those things in place, then we have a delivery unit that's working towards that. Now, all that simply has to happen here is that this delivery unit is providing us with an update on an annual basis about how much progress they have made in terms of trying to achieve some type of a key performance indicator. That again is being reported on an annual basis to heads of government, or even before the heads of government, to ministers with responsibility for trade. So for example, Ms. Husbands should be getting that report in advance, and then of course escalating that up to her head of government, for example. And I think finally what we need to do is have a report that is open and transparent so that all members of the public can see, and that we can actually now scrutinize about how much progress our governments, our private sector, our various line ministries, our regional agencies, how much progress are they making to actually getting us to achieve the KPI that we have set for 2025 or for 2030. Well, I have just tried to describe here, which I think is a really important aspect that we need to focus on. How do we go about implementing the various things that we keep speaking about all the time? We are so articulate in the Caribbean. We know how to speak and do all of these things. We know how to write great reports, but we really fall down on implementation. And I think that's really has to be the great focus for us now. And implementation is not only the responsibility of the government. We have to ensure that the private sector and other regional organizations are part of that as well.
Excellent, excellent. The only thing I would say is, as you have come up with these wonderful ideas, you should write them down. And we have to be careful that as we develop these units of reporting, that we don't add to the layer of bureaucracy. You know, so really mean and dirty and very focused committees, I think is where you're heading. So let me just do one thing. Let me try and sum up what I have heard about our Caribbean trade strategy from our illustrious panelists. We need a private sector focused Caribbean trade strategy that is stimulated with data and ideas by the University of the West Indies, that is supported by repurposed and realigned regional entities, and is ultimately executed by a transparent process that is government and CARICHAM led. So if I can just try to get in and I'm going to leave it with the panelists to tell me what was wrong with that vision. But before we do that, I want one of our students from the current cohort of the MITP, who is writing a paper, I know right now, for an SRC Trading Thoughts. And I just putting her on the spot now, Shaniko Sutherland, because at one of our board meetings, one of the board members, Matthew Wilson, said, we need to hear from the young people some more. So let me put Shaniko quickly, if you can. Tell us what a young person just trained in the MITP. Tell us what you think about what you just heard from all these stakeholders. Take it away.
Thank you, Jan. I thought that this forum has generated so much wonderful ideas that they match a lot of what we were taught during the program. But some of my thoughts I had from what was presented today are, I agree with that idea of doing a proper analysis of where we're not leveraging all the different market access we have negotiated in these trade agreements. But I'd also add that I think it's important to approach that from a regional level, in the sense that it would allow us to bridge those issues of scale or lack of economies of scale. So where there are gaps in those, approaching it from a regional level would allow us to fill that gap. And at the same time, it would also allow us to explore those other opportunities of South-South trade. Because I think while it's important for us to understand why we're not leveraging what we do have at present, I think South-South trade represents new opportunities for negotiations with a lower differentials in power, which can allow us to get better agreements negotiated. And I think the global stage now has an ecosystem where, for example, the African continent they're crafting an ecosystem to engage the diaspora more. We should be able to tap into that, and we may be able to get opportunities from that we might not be able to get outside of that. So I think, yes, we need to craft all these different elements and ensure that we understand why what we have is not working, as well as engaging the private sector, because we must do that. At the end of the day, the government isn't trading, the businesses, the private sector is who's trading. But at the same time, I think there are reasons why the existing situations are not giving us the level of development and growth that we want. So I think it's important that we also reach out to new areas like the South-South trade. So those are my thoughts.
Excellent. I did not ask her to say she learned everything under the MITP. I know, Honorable Sandra Husbands, thank you so much to Nico. And thank you for that perspective from the mouths of babes. So, Honorable Sandra Husbands, I know you have to make your break. I think we just have 5 more minutes. I'll ask you to give us 1 or 2 points to put into this beautiful Caribbean trade strategy we're concocting on this SRC lunchtime chat as you leave us.
I think one of the things, Jan Yves, is, for example, UNCTAD is coming up. We are involved in a lot of fora where we discuss the ideas instead of using fora to develop partnerships and alliances to actually do implementation. What I want to encourage everyone is when UNCTAD happens in April, I would like as many people as possible involved so that we can begin to discuss together, not just sit at the conference and hear the topics that are going on, but we should be having side engagements in which the CARICHAM private sector, the trade strategists and so on, where we sit down and ask ourselves, how can we take the Caribbean forward and how can we do that together? I think that that is something that would be important. Thank you so much. Excellent. I enjoyed it. And I look forward to if we can have a further discussion, not so much at lunchtime, but actually have a sit-down working session to take the idea that you, Jan Yves, have put forward as to how we're going to move to implementation and what Dr. Ram said. I thought everyone contributed really, really well. So enjoy the rest.
Thank you so much, Honorable Sandra Husbands, who's always a collaborator, always willing as an ex-MITP student, always reaching out to us to work on these collaborative ventures. So thank you so much for your presence here today. I know you have to run off. Thank you. So if I can just go down the line, last minute interventions, the last one, I'm really gonna keep it at 1 to 2 minutes each, and then we will do our thank yous and close off. Please, Professor Williams.
Oh, sorry. Quickly, Dr. Remy, I would say my quick intervention, 1, trade strategy needs to be firm-based, firm-centric. So we need to get our firms as they're the ones who trade. And the second thing I would say is to quickly add that we need to implement. We tend to just do a lot of the discussion and the intellectual engagement, but we don't do the implementation. So I would say having a roadmap for implementation and make them firm-based, firm-centric.
Wonderful. Dr. Driver.
Okay, three very quick things. 2 to do with CSME. 1, the CARICHAM skill certificate, expand it to a lot more skill areas and let the chambers of commerce or other association be the bodies which give out the skill certificates. It doesn't need to be a governmental process. I give out 15,000 certificates for people to work in the petrochemical sector in Trinidad every year. We should use those sort of systems. It should all be online and simple. So CSME, free movement of people, using the chambers to do it. 2, repurpose our foreign affairs, our embassies internationally, and make them CARICHAM trade facilitation officers in all of the markets. I know it's going to take a little bit of negotiations between the governments to make that happen, but to me that is such an obvious thing to have. We don't want ambassadors just going to cocktail parties for the sake of it. We want them going to cocktail parties to sell services and products from the Caribbean into those markets. The final thing is just with the CSME, we don't even have a double taxation agreement in place with all countries in CARICHAM. Suriname is outside the double taxation agreement. That makes services trade with Suriname very difficult for the rest of the region. Why is that not fixed? Just those are sort of little things that just need to get fixed.
And these are excellent, tangible ideas. Always can depend on the private sector to make the points we need to hear. Dr. Ram, and then I'll go straight to Ms. Pamela Cook-Hamilton to round us up. So Dr. Ram?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Remy. Well, I've said quite a few things, but I just want to add one last point. I think that it's important that be reminded that we can actually use the CARICHAM, the CSME area as our petri dish, but really we do have a lot of resources and capital within CARICHAM, which we don't tap into enough. And I think it's time for us to consider how we develop some type of in addition to our trade strategy, some type of a regional capital market that allows us to have capital, because we have about over 50 billion US dollars in our banking system that is searching to get higher rates of return. But we need to find some way of doing that by having some type of a regional capital market that can allow that capital to flow to areas within the Caribbean that can be actually very good areas for investment. So in addition to what I've said before, I think that is actually critical for us to have an important component of any trade strategy, because without the capital, our firms are going to be starved of resources, and there's a lot of capital out there which we are not tapping into. And in addition to that, that capital market can be the conduit to attract diaspora resources into the many businesses that we have here. And by doing so, immediately we open back up those markets where our diaspora are as well. So I think that that's an important area to add into this strategy.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Ms. Pamela Cook-Hamilton, the last word is with you.
Thanks, Dr. Remy. Just to answer Dax on the issue of diplomats. In defense of diplomats, I was one. They don't just go around drinking cocktails. They actually do a lot of work. But we do have, as ITC, a commercial diplomacy course that actually helps diplomats in the field develop their capacity to look for trade and investment opportunities. So that's something that we could also make available, to those who are just drinking cocktails. And, but I think what's even more important is, and the one thing I will say is, once you know the why, you'll get the how. And for me, that is the critical issue with the Caribbean. Are we committed to the CSME? Are we committed to regional integration? Are we committed to what we say we're committed to? And if we are, and that's the why, then getting to the how is not hard. I think the bigger question is, are we truly moving from an integrated standpoint into the rest of the world, or are we not? And that's a question that I can't answer, but I can say that it can change completely how we engage with the Africas, with the Asias, if we engage as a single unit, as opposed to separate interests.
Excellent,
So.
excellent. Thank you so much, all our speakers. We heard about old ideas, we heard new ideas, we heard new ways of looking at old things. I could not have done a better job of putting this together. And I'm so happy that you've all stayed on. We've lost a couple people, but we started a little late, so I'm going to say we kept to our 1 hour and 15 minutes. I hope I didn't rush anybody, but I wanted to keep it dynamic. Before I say final goodbyes, I just want to really reach out and thank Mrs. Marcia Thomas, who helped conceptualize this with the SRC staff, our research team, the director, IT support from Mr. Sam Eugene and Mr. Jermaine Atwell, who's right here, all those who circulated the flyers in their networks, all of you who supported the panelists and gave them really important points that they made, as well as the panelists themselves who gave up their time and their intellectual energy to make this such a wonderful event that I hope we get some nuggets out of and can formulate into a real Caribbean strategic approach to our trade negotiations to complement the work that the hard working staff I know at the OTN and the CARICHAM Secretariat are doing to move us in the right direction. Let me take the opportunity to tell you about 2 upcoming events that the SRC is working on. October 21st with UNCTAD, we are looking at the COVID impact on investment and the investor state discussions, and Alicia Nichols will be moderating that section. On October 29th 9th, we'll be working with the EUI under a new partnership that the UWI has negotiated with the EUI to look at COVID responses of the Caribbean and the EU. We yesterday released a document done by research staff Chelsea Brathwaite and Alicia Nichols. I assisted with supervision on trading our way to recovery. It's on our SRC website. So without further ado, let me thank you all for staying tuned on this Friday afternoon and Friday night. I know for you, Pam, and just thank you all for tuning in, and we will make this recording available to those who had the misfortune of missing it. Thank you all so very much, and stay tuned. Thanks. Thank you to everyone. Goodbye. We are, yeah,